Well, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. There will be more members joining us. I'm Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. I'm the bean counter of the group, so I guess I'm going to lead off this press conference. I'll start just by saying when I got here and when Senator Paul got here in 2011, we were $14.8 trillion in debt. We're spending about $3.6 trillion a year. Revenue is about $2.3 trillion. That obviously shows a $1.3 trillion deficit. Right now, today, currently, we're about $31.5 trillion in debt. We've doubled that over the course. Now, I don't think we're to blame, but it happened while we were here, and we didn't like it at all. The day after the November election, I wrote a column, the Wall Street Journal published it, and what it was is just trying to lay out, if we got the majority here, how we could return function and fiscal sanity to Congress. Now, obviously, we didn't get the majority, so we're not in charge of this, but the House does have a Republican majority. And I was very pleased to see in the whole speaker battle there, and I know it looked a little messy, but I think they accomplished some very good things, because I think hopefully what they did get Speaker McCarthy to agree to is restoring function. And what do I mean by that? We're talking about passing a budget, hopefully one that is as conservative as possible, close to balance as possible. If we can't balance it, well, we're going to have to increase the debt ceiling. But if we do that, we need to use the debt ceiling for the way it was intended to be used. You attach to it fiscal controls. I laid out 4 possibilities. And these are just suggestions. Preventing Government Shutdown Act, the REINS Act, the Full Faith and Credit Act, and one that's near and dear to my heart, one of the first pieces of legislation I introduced, reducing the size of the federal government through Attrition Act. You don't have to fire anybody, just quit hiring them, okay? But anyway, that kind of laid that, and then also just talk about, but then bring up, use that budget process to bring up individual appropriation bills. Now, why is that important? First of all, you understand the dysfunction in passing these massive omnibus spending bills 2, 3, 4 months into a fiscal year, thousands of pages, nobody reads them, and it just gets passed. Individual appropriation bills, they'll still be massive, but we'll be able to focus on the particular department. We'll be able to do greater oversight. Because part of the problem we have is we just never look at the numbers. And I've got the chart over here. I thought it was interesting when we were going through that debate prior to the omnibus vote. I was asking reporters, I was asking my colleagues, do you know how much we spent last year in the federal government? And quite honestly, nobody knew. But it wasn't their fault. Nobody knew because we never even talk about it. And I think when I told people $6.3 trillion, a lot of people were shocked. I think most people were shocked. And they should be shocked. Because if you take a look in 2019, prior to the pandemic, we spent $4.4 trillion. That was in all federal government spending was $4.4 trillion. Had the pandemic not occurred, had we not busted the budget with, unfortunately, an awful lot of wasteful spending reacting to it, and just grown that $4.4 trillion by the rate of inflation and population, last year we would have spent $5.1 trillion. Why do I point that out? Because we're so tantalizing, or we would have been so tantalizingly close to balancing the budget because last year we got $4.9 trillion worth of revenue. So we need to understand these numbers. We as a Congress need to be looking at these accounts, at these departments. We need to fully understand how the federal government is spending the taxpayers' hard-earned money, and we're not doing it right now. So I think there are a number of us that are talking to our House colleagues, meeting with them. I think the main purpose of this press conference, from my standpoint, is to offer support. That they're in the driver's seat. They can pass these bills. They can make this happen. Now, what happens to what they pass in the Senate? Well, that's the next step. But initially, we want to convey to our House colleagues that we respect what they've done. They've got a big task ahead of them. We want to do everything we can to support their efforts, but also encourage them, because the crucial aspect to what they need to do is they have to pass these things with Republican votes. Now, there's a number of us who have never voted for an increase in the debt ceiling. I would vote for an increase in the debt ceiling if we attach to it certain fiscal controls. And we as senators who have taken that position in the past, we need to, again, provide that support for our colleagues in the House, fiscal conservatives, that also will take votes they've never taken in the past. But if we want to have the best result, they're going to have to take those types of votes this year. So again, we're trying to be supportive here. We'll be talking, we'll be meeting with them. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Senator Cruz.
Over the past 2 decades, Congress has been bankrupting our nation. If you go back to the year 2000, our national debt was $5 trillion. That sounds like a wildly different world than where we are today, because it was a wildly different world. Think about that for a moment. 42 presidents over the course of more than 2 centuries had built up a total debt of $5 trillion. Then a Republican came into office, George W. Bush. And over the next 8 years, under a Republican president, our national debt went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. We doubled the national debt in just 8 years. Then a Democrat came into office, Barack Obama. And over the next 8 years, the national debt doubled yet again, going from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. Now pause and reflect on that. 42 presidents over 2 centuries build $5 trillion in debt. 2 presidents, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, over just 16 years, quadrupled our national debt. And now over the last 6 years, again with a Republican president and a Democrat president, we've seen national debt grow from $20 trillion to $31.5 trillion. This is unsustainable. The American people at home, if you're fed up with inflation, if you're fed up with the cost of food skyrocketing, with the cost of electricity, of rent, of lumber, of mortgages, of gasoline, of cars, of everything you buy, it's because politicians in Washington cannot stop spending money that we don't have. Now, we are at a moment in time because the American people elected a Republican majority in the House where we have an opportunity to stop the madness. And I believe it is incumbent on that Republican majority and on Republicans in the Senate to use every lever point we have to stop the out-of-control spending that is driving inflation, that is punishing hardworking Americans across this country. As everyone here is writing, the debt ceiling is coming up. And the debt ceiling historically has proven the most effective lever point to force meaningful concessions. Now let me dispense with a canard. Nobody standing here wants to default on the debt. Let me be absolutely clear and unequivocal. The United States of America should never, ever, ever default on its debt. And whether or not the debt ceiling is raised immediately, the United States will not default on its debt. Why? Because revenue that comes in each month exceeds the interest payments that are owed. There is more than sufficient revenue coming in to ensure we never default on the debt. And every one of us supports legislation I call the Default Prevention Act, to put that in statute, to make clear the chances of a default are 0.00%. The reason the Default Prevention Act hasn't been passed is the Democrats block it. There is one principal person in this town that is talking about a default of the debt, and that is Joe Biden. Joe Biden wants to threaten a default in the debt. He wants to scare the markets. And frankly, he's counting on y'all. He's counting on the press corps just to repeat his talking points. He's counting on the press corps just to say, those crazy Republicans want to default on the debt. That is false. And if you write that in your stories, You are simply repeating partisan talking points from the White House. Historically, the debt ceiling has proven incredibly effective. In 2011, by standing strong on the debt ceiling, the Republican majority in the House forced passage of the Budget Control Act, the most significant constraint in federal spending in modern times. When I arrived here in 2013, Republican leadership was crowing about the great fiscal responsibility they saw because of the Budget Control Act. And then they turned around and abandoned it a couple years later. You go back before that, Graham Rudman, the most significant structural restraint on spending, passed because Congress held up the debt ceiling and used its leverage to force those reforms. And so I'm going to urge the members of the press, as this fight plays out, report it accurately. The rules of the Republican conference provide not that we will never raise the debt ceiling. It is not my position that we will never raise the debt ceiling. Rather, what the rules say is we will use the debt ceiling as leverage to force real and meaningful structural reforms to fix the underlying problem. It doesn't have to be a total solution for everything, but it has to be real and meaningful progress. And I will point out those rules that were written in the rules, I wrote them alongside the other senators who are standing up here today. That is the official position of the Republican conference. So we're going to see lots of fireworks. We're going to see lots of drama. We're going to see lots of Democrats. By the way, Joe Biden's position is facially unreasonable and ridiculous. Here's Joe Biden's position. I refuse to negotiate anything. That's what he's telling you. I don't care that there's a Republican majority. I don't care that we're bankrupting the country. I don't care that there's inflation ravaging this country. I, Joe Biden, will negotiate nothing. To hell with you. Let's default. That's Joe Biden's position. And on its face, it is objectively unreasonable. The reason he can take that objectively unreasonable position is because he believes the press will protect him. He believes that in your coverage, you won't talk about how it's objectively unreasonable for the president to say, I don't care what the Congress says. My answer is hell no. He's counting on you for that. That's unreasonable. It's irresponsible. And we're here to encourage the members of the House and the members of the Senate to hold the line and get serious about fixing this problem.
Senator Paul.
President Biden says he won't negotiate over raising the debt ceiling. I have news for him. He absolutely will negotiate. Conservatives will not vote to raise the debt ceiling. The majority in the House, Republican majority in the House, will not vote to raise the debt ceiling without significant budget reform. The greatest threat to our country is, and the greatest threat to our national security is the debt. One of the great things about where we are now, though, is it really doesn't take as much as you would think to actually balance the budget. In Europe, over half of the countries balance their annual budget. We think of Europe, of Germany and Sweden, of having these large governments, and they do, but they're actually fiscally responsible in the sense that they spend what comes in. We could do it in our country. If we were to have a $100 billion cut, which would still have us spending way more than we spent before COVID, a $100 billion cut in free spending, we would balance our budget in just 4 years. This is amazing. We have an opportunity here. It could be done, but it would take compromise between both parties. Republicans would have to give up the sacred cow that says we will never touch a dollar in military, and the Democrats would have to give up the sacred cow that they will never touch a dollar in welfare. Everything would have to be looked across the board. No one has a sacred area that would be immune, and when you make the cuts across the board, they aren't as big as you'd actually think they would be. It's a responsible thing to do, but President Biden needs to know, absolutely, he will negotiate, and it's better to start now.
Senator Scott.
First, I want to thank the House. There's a lot of things the House has done in the last 3 weeks to do exactly what they campaigned on. And my goal is that the Senate start doing the exact same thing. We have a Republican Party out around the country. We need to have a Republican Party here, and Republicans need to stop caving. With regard to the debt ceiling, the far left, the big government crowd, and Wall Street tell you all the time, they put out all the time, you have to spend more money, run up more debt, and raise taxes. And if you ever say that you need to stop, then they say the world will end and we'll have plagues that even Moses would flinch at. It is a complete lie. We can balance the budget, right? Our states do it, countries do it. Now, if we don't balance a budget, who makes money? Well, DC bureaucrats do really well. The people that make money off of government, they do really well. Wall Street sells a whole bunch more bonds, they do really well. The rich are going to continue to get richer. And guess what happens to the American public? Their mortgage rates go up, their credit card interest rates go up, eggs cost more, meat costs more, and the average American is paying for all this. Now, I did this. I did this when I was governor. I walked in with a $4 billion budget deficit, and the same thing happened. If you don't spend more money, borrow more money, Florida had borrowed a net additional $1 billion a year for 20 straight years, and they were going into default on their debt. We balanced the budget. We actually cut taxes. And in 8 years, we grew our economy, I think, by over 20%, and we added 1.7 million jobs. This is all doable, and if we don't, when anyone that goes to the grocery store this week, you can blame everybody in D.C. that's not willing to live within our means for your interest rates going up and the cost of your eggs and meat going up.
Senator Brown.
So you heard Senator Cruz talk about how quickly we got into this pickle, basically just a little over 20 years, which gives you a little bit of extrapolate that into the future. And the only politician who's had the nerve to put a budget out has been from the President, Biden. So he, unapologetic about it, shows us from this 31 trillion we're in debt, taking all of us to 45 trillion in just 10 years. And that's way under the mark because interest rates have gone up 4 percentage points by the Fed here recently. So a couple of little fun facts. You remember before Christmas I asked a reporter to tell me what 1% of 30 trillion was? Anybody remember that? Remember, it wasn't easy to come up with it, and the first guess was 300 million. Well, it's 300 billion. The numbers I just gave you in terms of what Biden is unapologetically and brazenly saying for the future of our country, 45 trillion in debt, doesn't take into consideration the interest cost and the crowding out. And the reason I want you to know what 1% of 30 trillion is, take 4% of 30 trillion. That's the interest that's going to get priced in to the cost of carrying this debt. You do the math with what we're currently paying in interest, that's as much interest as we just spent on that monstrosity of an omnibus bill that just went through the door at 1.7 trillion. And these are numbers for future generations. You ought to just think, what the heck is going on? Who is running the show? And the other thing Senator Cruz said, it's been an equal opportunity endeavor between Democrats and Republicans, because the folks that have been running the place have been looting the place in the sense that, sure, with the printing press in the basement, with a credit card that you can swipe year after year, any knucklehead could do that. And really, knuckleheads have been getting us into the place we are now. And remember the numbers. The numbers always rule in the long run. The heavy weight of that burden will be unescapable and it'll be painful if you don't do what Senator Paul talked about. Exercise a little political discipline and will. Quit trying to please everyone, and that means defense and domestic, and maybe you'll get the ship turned in the right direction.
Senator Lee.
Bipartisanship is very common in some areas and less common in others. Tragically, increasing the debt ceiling has been a bipartisan venture. And it's happened in a way that sort of pits us together as Americans, not as Democrats against Republicans, so much as Washington, D.C. and Wall Street against everyone else. America's poor and middle class have been ravaged by this pattern and practice of abuse. One that enriches a small handful of elites at the cost of everyone else. I keep thinking about how prices have increased over the last couple of years. Just in the last couple of years, the average Utah family's monthly living expenses have gone up $1,000 a month every single month. That's a recurring expense. That is the direct, foreseeable, and in fact foreseen and avoidable result of Congress pushing the button over and over and over again to effectively print more money. You see, that's what happens when you just print more money, as you effectively do, when you spend trillions of dollars a year more than you have, and you increase the debt ceiling, authorizing the issuance of new U.S. debt instrument. That creates more money moving through circulation, which means every dollar that someone has to buy bread, eggs, milk, or to pay for housing, transportation, or whatever it is, it buys less. Most people don't see their incomes rising, if they're rising at all. They don't see them rising commensurate with inflation, and not even close. And so as a result, poor and middle-class Americans are being ravaged. It really is tragic that this has happened with such bipartisan cooperation, or I would say collusion. And the reason is, if either party, if sufficient members of either party had at any point stepped in and said, enough, let's not do this, things might have been different. And it's a lot easier to stop additional harm from happening than to undo previous harm. So this has gone on far too long. It's disappointing to us that a lot of members of our own party have been unwilling to do the difficult things. We are hoping and expecting this time it may be different. We understand that there are a lot of realities that we have to face, but one of those realities is this: the overall number is simply too big. We're going to devastate not only the poor and middle class of this country even further if we don't stop this, but we're also simultaneously going to impair the federal government's ability to fund everything from Social Security and Medicare to defense and everything in between if we don't change course. It's one of the reasons why, as a conference in the last year or two, the Senate Republican Conference adopted a policy statement. And that policy statement is echoed in a letter that I've authored and that's been joined so far by a couple dozen of my colleagues. We're still collecting signatures. A letter addressed to President Biden in which we echo our conference position, in which we explain what it is that we're going to do. The conference position itself says that it's our policy that, quote, any increase in the debt ceiling must be accompanied by cuts in federal spending of an equal or greater amount as the debt ceiling increase, or meaningful structural reform in spending. And so, look, it's got to be different. It has to be, because the consequences of staying on the same course are too devastating for us to contemplate, certainly too devastating for us to accept.
Any questions? Sir.
Senator Johnson, I understand what Senator Cruz said earlier about the leverage point that you had here, but when we talk about debt ceiling and we talk about spending, they are two different pieces of legislation functionally. So how would you go about this? What would make you feel comfortable in voting for raising for the debt ceiling? Are you talking about the next spending package, or are you talking about cuts to an existing spending package? And just functionally, what would that legislative package look like that you would feel comfortable
Well, again, they're already enacting special measures, and that will go on for months, potentially. Again, we're looking for the conservatives in the House, Republicans, to lead in this effort. And we're going to hopefully influence what they're asking for in exchange for an increase in the debt ceiling as they're putting together their budget. I mean, it's all wrapped up together. You have the budget. If the budget's not balanced, you're going to have to increase the debt ceiling. You're going to have to, you're going to have to increase it anyway because of what has been agreed to in the past. But we can't really predict exactly when those votes are going to come. But we're just, before you hear today, saying that in order for us and hopefully our Republican colleagues to agree to increase the debt ceiling, whether it's once or twice, we need to attach to it fiscal controls or other spending cuts. Exactly what those are, we're not willing to lay out here today. We're going to be doing that in consultation with the House.
I mean, that would be a big part of it, though, right? What you're willing to cut. Like, at what point would you? I mean, Senator Paul, you alluded to it, that you've got to touch things like the Pentagon. You've got to touch entitlement programs, probably. At what point will Republicans definitively say these are the programs that we think should be cut and how much they should be cut?
Again, we can't really say that. Again, I'm personally more concerned about the structural changes right now. I mean, the Preventing Government Shutdown Act, the REINS Act, full faith and credit. I mean, that's an important piece of legislation. I think Senator Scott is reintroducing that. That was a Pat Toomey bill. And that just basically says with the revenue coming in, there's no reason whatsoever to default. Senator Cruz was correct. I mean, this is a scare tactic. We have more than enough revenue coming in to pay Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, interest on the debt, service our debt, and a lot more spending.
When we did this in 2011, they were linked in the same legislation, and you simply institute caps. So if you put caps on numbers, then it's determined by the different committees where exactly they will cut, and that takes time to get up with each individual things. But there's no reason why raising the debt ceiling can't have spending caps or limitations on spending in the same bill.
I want to say one thing too on that. So recently, did you hear the news where the Pentagon did an audit of its assets? It probably didn't even hit the radar. So they've got $3.5 trillion in assets between equipment and materiel. And they did an audit and can find only 39% of them. Imagine that, of what you own in a household or a business. So the point in terms of how it works is you get the structure in place, you talk about caps, and yes, it's going to have to come from both ends of the ledger in terms of how you do it. I always say in running a business, which I did for 37 years, a couple others had did it for a long time as a career, you're going to say you had to just cut 1%, like the penny plan. Most people aren't going to know if they've got 99 or 100 or something. You act like it's the end of the world. It's easy to do. Back when businesses went through the downturn in 08 and 09, they were having to make much larger cuts than that to survive. If they didn't, they had competition and all the other things that they had to contend with. Here, the money is given to us. And it's not that complicated if you've got the political will to do it. And then it's going to have to come from all the places that are busting the budget across the spectrum.
So if you look in business, the best way to balance your budget is grow your revenues. So I'm a business guy. What I always try to do is dramatically grow my revenues, and then it was easy to balance your budget and make a profit. I did the exact same thing when I was governor of Florida. We grew our revenues. We grew our revenues by reducing taxes. We did reduce taxes and fees 100 times. We got rid of 20% of the regulations. We stopped being a pain in the butt to every citizen and every business. The federal government is a pain in the butt to all of us. They want to tell every one of us how to lead our lives. They want to tell every business how to lead their lives. And all you do is end up with a sluggish economy. If we don't grow this economy, we will never get out of this problem. We can't cut ourselves to success. You have to grow your economy, which grows your revenues. And your revenues grow exponentially if you can grow your economy. But there's not even a thought process up here to how to grow the economy.
One of the biggest things that we're hearing from Democrats is that Republicans want to cut Social Security and Medicare. Is that something you support?
No, that's a total lie. No, we've been hearing, campaigning, I heard that through 3 campaigns. I've never said that at all. We want to save Social Security, and the way we do it is primarily what Senator Scott was talking about. The number one component of a solution is economic growth, which is why we cut taxes in 2017, moving into 2018. And it worked. Look at how much revenue it's grown over $1 trillion since then, and that is even with the COVID recession. So growing the economy is the number one component, but we still have to be fiscally responsible. And going from $4.4 trillion in spending to over $6 trillion and kind of laying that in as a baseline is grossly irresponsible. And I've got to agree with Senator Brown and Senator Scott. In business, that happens all the time where you're asked to cut your budget 10% and people do it. So the private sector can do it. Why should the government be immune?
And if you don't, you get fired.
And you know who cut Medicare is the Democrats. They did it in September in their spending bill. They cut $280 billion out of Medicare. So they want to say Republicans want to cut Medicare. None of us support cutting Medicare benefits, but they actually did it.
And again, the greatest threat to any of those programs is this massive debt. Again, as Senator Brown said, every 1% increase is another $310 billion. Times 4, $1.2, $1.3 trillion. That we spend $1.2 trillion a year on Social Security. That's the magnitude of what we're talking about because of this out of control spending and these deficits. Yep.
Why is it such a struggle for even a group of conservative senators here to identify what to cut? If you're talking a $30 trillion deficit that you want to eliminate and put the country on a path of a balanced budget, that requires either a lot of cuts or a lot of tax increases, right? Why not lead the way and show Congress how to do it?
Well, there have been a number of proposals in terms of doing that, but again, we're going down this process now, step by step. The first one is to pass the budget, which will contemplate those types of cuts. You know, Senator Paul has different proposals. There's a number of ways of doing it, but we need to first get the structural process in place.
One quick point. I mean, that's a false argument. That's made all the time by the left-wing media. Oh, you don't point it out. On my Festivus report, which we put out every year, this year was $482 billion worth of waste. Now, I'll give you some examples. They're small, but they added up to $482 billion. The National Science Foundation spent $118,000 studying whether Thanos, who's a Marvel Comics evil overlord and snaps his finger and lightning comes out of his fingers, your tax dollars went to the National Science Foundation to hire a guy to put metal gloves on to snap his fingers to see if you can snap your fingers in metal gloves. $700,000 to see if kids are better coped with pets. $650,000 to study why male parrots like female parrots and how they pursue them. I could go on.
You know, I also want to point out in business, we're the board of directors, okay? You don't go to the manager and say, this is specifically where you're going to cut. You go to them and say, cut your budget 10%. And then you have those managers do it. So you're going to rely on the people in the agencies to do it the best way, but we've got to starve some of these agencies.
Senator, do you expect the House Republicans to pass a budget before there's a debt limit deal later this year? And do you think they need to lay out a fiscal roadmap? And also, you know, can the fiscal reforms you want be achieved through discretionary spending cuts alone, or do some entitlement reforms
Well, you know,
looked at, whatever they do?
Yeah, obviously, you know, my words were distorted by saying, you know, we do need to, if we're going to get ourselves out of this debt hole, we're going to have to look at everything every year. You can't just wall off 70% of the budget and say, we're not going to look at it. It's just an automatic pilot. I mean, that is what is driving us into this, you know, debt crisis right now. But in terms of when the House is going to do things, that'll be up to the House. I'm here today to support their efforts and do everything we can to encourage people that have never voted for an appropriation bill or a debt ceiling to say, if we're going to get the best deal possible, you're going to be willing to vote for these things. I'm willing to do it here in the Senate.
So, Senator Johnson, who in the House are you talking to? You said you're talking to someone.
No, we're talking to conservatives in the House. I'll leave it at that.
But are these some of the folks that got concessions from McCarthy trying to validate his speakership?
No, the conservatives in the House.
We all have relationships in our
Yeah.
states, too. We're talking to all those.
Senator Johnson, since Speaker McCarthy's election, it seems like House Republican leaders have kind of backtracked on this idea of cutting funding to the military. You know, some, like Scalise, have even gone as far as to say that that's not on the table, that's not something that they're going to entertain. So is that something that's acceptable to you? I mean, all of you seem to be on board with the fact that, like, it needs to be on the table.
Yeah, but listen, I think you have to look at all spending. I'm making the point, it's a step-by-step process. First of all, you have to understand how much we're spending. People don't even understand that basic. That's what I was pointing out when I was asking that question prior to the omnibus vote. You know, how much we spend annually? Nobody knew. So you have to familiarize yourself with the numbers. You know, we're the board of directors, and so many of the members of the board have no idea what we spend. They just vote for these omnibus spending bills without ever reading them. That's complete dysfunction. That has to change.
Go to Julia
So
for
wait.
a second and then one more.
Speaking of the numbers, because someone asked about raising revenues, I put through a privilege motion, and Rand's done it often, a balanced budget over 10 years in my case. And the biggest data set that we collected was that over 50 years, regardless of the tax rate, our revenues stay about 18 to 18.5% of the GDP. Check it out. When you have a high rate, you're going to generate a lower economic activity. If you got a lower rate, it was just proven. I almost had the CBO admitting that pre-COVID, the tax cuts that were done in 2017 were paying for themselves. Plus, we had an economic growth of 2.5% to 3%. So the whole idea that you can raise revenues to do it, that's not going to work. 50 years of data show that those hang in that narrow range. So that means that you're going to have to do it growing the economy, which was mentioned earlier. That's one easier way to do it. And then holding your expenditures into that historical band of revenues that we raise, proven over 50 years.
Senator Johnson?
Yeah.
I have one on a different topic. As Vice Chair of the Senate Ukraine Caucus, what's your reaction to the administration's plans to send battle tanks to Ukraine?
we just came from a secure briefing on that. The question I had is, how are they going to change the dynamics on the field? So I certainly want to support the people of Ukraine, but at some point in time, we're going to start recognizing what the reality of the ground is. Thank you.